So right now we're standing at the Otahanga North Wetland. We're just almost at the active phase of construction here. So in this sector we've got three sort of different habitats really. We've got indigenous wetland vegetation on the Kapiti coast. Approximately 97.5% of the old wetland vegetation has been cleared, so we're dealing with literally 2.5% still remain today. So these areas are ecologically really important. There's a lot of rules with the regional council and the district council in terms of protecting these areas. Along the alignment, quite a few of these wetlands are protected by statute through Queen Elizabeth II Trust covenants. We've got Kapiti Coast District Council significant natural area listings on a number of them, so they have their own sort of set of rules. Wetlands are home to a lot of sort of species. We've confirmed that there's no fish living in these wetlands through earlier studies, so fish aren't a worry, but the nature of the plants and other species that are in here are really important. So one of the consent conditions, particularly at the Otahanga wetlands right here, is as the construction phase comes through, they excavate the peat out, replacing it with sand or other aggregate, and there's a consent requirement that as far as practicable, all of the wetland plants, or most of the wetland plants of a particular species, are taken out and lifted up and transplanted. And that's going to be quite onerous, because I think we've counted in the order there might be sort of 500 plants or something like that have to be manually sort of taken out of here, uplifted, holes dug, transported and then put into place. In essence, if you lose 100 square metres of wetland on the alignment, we have to create 5.5 times the amount. So along the alignment we're losing 1.8 hectares of wetland and we're having to replace it with about 6.5 hectares. And obviously we've got to find that land, it's got to be suitable land. It's all got to be planted up from farmland and then maintained and protected in perpetuity. So it is quite onerous. So again, it's sort of its best endeavours really in terms of the project budget to sort of minimise the loss and be quite aware about where we can sort of refine through detailed design and construction to really shrink in that construction footprint at these critical areas.
It is very easy to damage the environment, and a wetland in particular. Once you've cut across it and you start to drain it, it will never recover. If you like to go back before 1820, when you could move by a small canoe from Paikakariki right through to Tohoro, utilising the wetlands and the forest that was there. You could live off those wetlands. Now all of that is gone, and today we look at the proposal to recreate things.
What we're seeing today behind us is a real conduit in terms of species movement upstream to the Hemi-Mating is behind us, the Ngāmanu wetland systems, and downstream to Te Harakeke wetland or Kawakahia wetland before going to the coast. It's a highly mobile stream, quite fast moving, sandy bottoms. Historically, this would have been one of the watercourses that would have drained a lot of these low-lying peat areas, which would have all been wetlands that are now sort of our farmland drained swamp forest. Some of the species today are under the Conservation Act listed as nationally threatened or at risk, including the long finial, the cockapoo. And it's just a small thing like a culvert being set at the wrong height or a bridge going in wrong. It's not just sort of wiping out that section of stream, but potentially in the long term, if the culvert's wrong right under the bridge here, perhaps putting out the whole catchment and wiping out species from that. And it's the role in the sort of ecosystem, the wider food chain that these species provide as well. Key target species really would be the long fin deal, the short fin eel, and hopefully we might be able to get some smelt, inanga, and some of the whitebait species. Maybe ideally, if we're really lucky, we'd find the mighty giant cockapoo, which is known from the stream. So I think we're in the order of about 10 to 14 species present in this stream. All the species we'd be targeting today are diadromous species, so that means they've got a saline component of their life cycle. They are going out to sea to breed and then coming upstream to lay their eggs. Again, it shows you the importance of making sure your culverts are installed at the right height, those sort of things, and that you are having due regard to these species in terms of the construction footprint. So the installation of culverts, the fish have to be able to swim up through these what are going to be some quite long, lengthy culverts, to be able to continue that spawning and breeding process. Early one morning my colleague was up here surveying and spotted a fernbird, a North Island fernbird, and it turned out to be the first observation of that species since the early 1950s that was a confirmed sighting. So that raised a few alarm bells at the time, given we had only seen the one bird. It wasn't known from this particular area, although there was some indication that it may have been present in the landscape, but no one had ever confirmed it. The fernbird's a species, it's classified as at risk, and unfortunately for this project it does live in blackberry. So as we sort of see around the landscape, there is a lot of blackberry, particularly around the drains and areas of land that aren't sort of actively grazed. A lot of land historically owned by NZTA or Kapiti Coast District Council in the designation. So we have to sort of pay particular attention to the times of year when the fernbird are breeding. So it is, in essence, the requirement would be to avoid the habitat of that species between pretty well about August and March. So from a construction perspective, the key time to be clearing that vegetation would be outside of those months. We've also got the New Zealand pipit, which unfortunately, again for the alignment, it's an at-risk species and its preferred breeding habitat is pasture. Once we're into that sector, which is going to be coming live in January 2014, we're going to have to be implementing a sort of a pretty tough pasture management regime, which would involve sort of overstocking with cattle and sheep to really keep that pasture down through the breeding season if construction's happening in that breeding season. And that is all about sort of restricting the species from nesting and utilising that habitat. This is really driven by Department of Conservation sort of requirements in terms of the the management of these at-risk and threatened listed species. Now we're standing south of the Otahanga wetland, just by the Otahanga yard, and behind us in this image is another area of valued vegetation. This is the Otahanga Kānuka forest. You can see by the size of the trees, it's some pretty ancient vegetation here. Possibly remnant, we're not sure, but certainly is in that order of potentially a couple of 100 years old. Again, this is one of the areas of vegetation that's listed in the resource consent conditions that is valued, and while we're sort of cutting into this a little bit, it's a best endeavours consent condition that we're as far as possible trying to minimise effects. So over the last few months we've been doing a lot of detailed work trying to sort of pull back the cycleway walkway back close to the expressway and trying to minimise the amount of cut that's affecting this bit of vegetation. Like the wetlands, if we're losing 100 square metres more of Kānuka, you're replacing it with 2 times the amount. Again, one of the consent requirements is that as the Mānuka or Kānuka are being cut down, that's stored off-site. We're going to try and use the vegetation in the canopy as a brush to sort of promote more Mānuka or Kānuka growth. And then one of the other funny requirements of the consent condition is we have to stockpile the tree trunks, and they've got to be sliced up into discs and stored off-site somewhere or appropriate place. And then once the planting has happened, the landscape and visual and ecological sort of mitigation planting, once that's been established, there's a requirement that these Mānuka discs get scattered through the landscape to form habitat for lizards that's potentially being lost as part of the construction project. So again, just to really remind people that these are quite important, and there's a whole process right through to clearance, stockpiling and actually looking after these things.
People coming from all over the place, all over the world in fact, to work on this project, when they leave, I hope they take away memories of what they did, but I hope they also leave behind something that we can all enjoy and be proud of.